June 28, Allen Ginsberg, Naropa Session 1.
Home. So we're on Williams, having focused finally on his conception of no ideas but in things, and some literal fact as part of his theory of being sticking close to the nose. Smell. O strong-ridged and deeply hollowed nose of mine, what will you not be smelling? What tactless asses we are, you and I, bony nose, always indiscriminate, always unashamed. And now it is the souring flowers of the bedraggled poplars, a festering pulp on the wet earth beneath them. With what deep thirst we quicken our desires to that rank odor of a passing springtime. Can you not be decent? Can you not reserve your ardors for something less unlovely? What girl will care for us, do you think, if we continue in these ways? Must you taste everything? Must you know everything? Must you have a part in everything? So he's the phrase close to the nose comes from one of his essays. And when you get that close to your own breath, your own smell, your own senses, and that humorous and acceptance of them, having agreed to work with the senses, and having discovered the vastness and tolerance and expansiveness of the senses, the injudiciousness and ecstasy of the senses, there comes a funny kind of self-acceptancy characteristic of Americans displayed in Whitman. I celebrate myself and sing myself, and what I shall assume, you shall assume. For every atom of me as good belongs to you. I find no fat sweeter than that sticks to my own bones. I wear my hat indoors or out as I please. Dance Russe. Complete self-incorporation. If, when my wife is sleeping, and the baby and Kathleen are sleeping, and the sun is a flame-white disk in silken mists, above shining trees, if I in my north room dance naked, grotesquely, before my mirror, waving my shirt round my head and singing softly to myself, I am lonely, lonely. I was born to be lonely. I am best so. If I admire my arms, my face, my shoulders, flanks, buttocks, against the yellow drawn shades, who shall say I am not the happy genius of my household? So there's like a psychological correlative to mindfulness, some development of self-reliance, and a firm grasp of the ultimate reality of subjective sensation as being no more than you can bargain for. You better settle for that. At least as evidence to begin with in proceeding with the poetics. But this is sensation with the senses, the six senses at least, mental sensations. What follows, as with haikus, is him getting up in the morning early as a doctor and going out and looking around in the streets of northern Jersey, turning his attention outside of himself. January morning, a sweet. I have discovered that most of the beauties of travel are due to the strange hours we keep to see them. The domes of the Church of the Paulist Fathers in Weehawken against a smoky dawn, the heart stirred, are beautiful as St. Peter's approached after years of anticipation. So he goes out into his own town and takes note of little delicate details. And a young horse with a green bedquilt on his withers, shaking his head, bared teeth and nozzle high in the air. That's very similar to Reznikov's little details. And the worn blue car rails, like the sky, gleaming among the cobbles. And the rickety ferry boat, Arden. What an object to be called Arden among the great piers on the ever-new river. The young doctor is dancing with happiness in the sparkling wind, alone at the prow of the ferry. He notices the curdy barnacles and broken ice crusts left at the slip's base by the low tide, and thinks of summer and green shell-crusted ledges among the emerald eelgrass. Work hard all your young days and they'll find you too some morning, staring up under your chiffonier at its warped basswood bottom, and your soul out among the little sparrows behind the shutter. So when he finally thinks of like what is soul and what happens to death, there's nothing but objective activity, detail, sparrows out behind the shutter, instead of a horrific fantasy based on words that would give him a bum kick. Except also the practical fantasy of there he is, flopped down in his furnished room on the rug, his head rolled under the chiffonier, a large wooden chest with drawers where you keep your clothes. Yes?
What's horrific?
Pardon me?
Did you say horrific?
Horrific. Horrible. Miltonic variety of horrible. Horrific. Nice word. All this was for you, old woman. I wanted to write a poem that you would understand. For what good is it to me if you can't understand it? But you got to try hard. But, well, you know how the young girls run giggling on Park Avenue after dark when they ought to be home in bed? Well, that's the way it is with me somehow. So there's detail and there's humor in relation to his own self. And there's a beginning of a kind of bodhisattva attitude toward all this was toward the hearers outside of the canon of ordinary poetry or traditional poetry. These are for poems actually written for his wife, his mother, his neighbors, poems that actually can be communicated to ordinarily considered non-poetic people, because they're using words made out of the materials of ordinary conversation, and they're dealing with matters that can be apprehended by eyeball and ear and senses, so that there's common ground and common territory. And it's very clear, clean territory, because the words have all been washed clean of other associations, and the perceptions have been washed clean of ideological reference, and there's nothing but the thing itself sitting before him, the natural objects, their own adequate symbols of themselves. All things are symbols of themselves. Another Gnostic thought, or it's a Tibetan Buddhist thought. All things are symbols of themselves. Or no ideas but in things, still. So there was that led to that poignant moment on Thursday. I have had my dream like others, Thursday. I have had my dream like others, and it has come to nothing, so that I remain now carelessly with feet planted on the ground and look up at the sky, feeling my clothes about me, the weight of my body in my shoes, the rim of my hat, air passing in and out at my nose, and decide to dream no more. So that kind of intersects all common newspaper consciousness. Old guys in the saloon gave up, Williams gave up, Buddha gave up, Christ gave up, everybody gave up, and found themselves on earth. To be perceptive, or do what? In this case, to continue trying to clarify the language and create little clear rhythmic structures within the language that, drawn from the speech of his townspeople, could communicate to them in a familiar way, be so subtle that they wouldn't notice it was poetry. And with that also came a great deal of compassion, social compassion, noticing how hard up people were. There's a very beautiful poem about America called To Elsie. Considering how mixed up everybody else was in their language and how mixed up they were in their desires, substituting desires for television for desire for clear language, or practice of clear language, or substituting argument for clear language. The pure products of America go crazy. Mountain folk from Kentucky, or the ribbed north end of Jersey with its isolate lakes and valleys, its deaf mutes, thieves, old names, and promiscuity between devil-may-care men who have taken to railroading out of sheer lust of adventure, and young slatterns bathed in filth from Monday to Saturday to be tricked out that night with gauds from imaginations which have no peasant traditions to give them character, but flutter and flaunt sheer rags, succumbing without emotion, save numbed terror under some hedge of chokecherry or viburnum, which they cannot express, unless it be that marriage, perhaps with a dash of Indian blood, will throw up a girl so desolate, so hemmed around with disease or murder, that she'll be rescued by an agent, reared by the state, and sent out at 15 to work in some hard-pressed house in the suburbs, some doctor's family, some Elsie, voluptuous water, expressing with broken brain the truth about us, her great, ungainly hips and flopping breasts addressed to cheap jewelry and rich young men with fine eyes, as if the earth under our feet were an excrement of some sky, and we, degraded prisoners, destined to hunger until we eat filth, while the imagination strains after deer, going by fields of goldenrod in the stifling heat of September. Somehow it seems to destroy us. It is only an isolate flex that something is given off. No one to witness and adjust, no one to drive the car.
It's called Elsie?
Well, it's section 2 Elsie. To Elsie. It's on page 270 of the collected earlier poems. That was one of the first I heard him read, I think. What was interesting is the relevant to what we've been talking about in terms of working with the particular and accepting the particular, or accepting the self, accepting the place where we are, means accepting the suffering of the situation, and as well as accepting the realization that we've all sold ourselves out for heaven and sold the earth out and are not appreciative of what we have already, as if the earth under our feet were an excrement of some sky. And we degraded prisoners destined to hunger until we eat filth.
Will you say something about the line addressed to
Rich young men with fine eyes.
addressed to cheap ornamental jewelry or something?
Her hips and flopping breasts addressed, I get dressed with cheap jewelry. Addressed means as well dressed with cheap jewelry. But addressed her sex and woman parts addressed to rich young men with fine eyes who take advantage of her, giving herself to, as a 15-year-old hard-working maid sent out by the state to work as a cowgirl in the doctor's office. There's the young prince of the family coming along up in the attic to fuck her and give her a baby, get an abortion or whatever. So he was just noting the
I guess
sociology of it.
The word addressed,
It's interesting.
Yeah.
Her great ungainly hips and flopping breasts addressed to cheap jewelry and rich young men with fine eyes, as if the earth under our feet. As if that was the best she could do, as if that was all that fate had for her, or as if that's all that she could ask for, all that she knew to ask for. It's only in isolate flecks that something is given off. Those are the poems. Those are his poems, I think he was referring to, as well as isolate flecks of perception occasionally. Isolate flecks of perception when we penetrate through our illusions and our daydreams and see our own condition, our own lack love, our own imprecision, our own denial of our own desires and denial of our own perceptions. No one to drive the car. It's a funny metaphor. I guess it's a metaphor for that condition of American life he was talking about. Using in a very American image. No one to drive the car of the mind, I guess. One poem of his I always liked, which does contain a great deal of direct detail, a little portrait or character. As Eliot said of Williams, or to Williams, when he met him, Mr. Williams, I admire your characters, let's have more of them. Characters meaning little portraits, sketch portraits of persons. Williams got real mad thinking that Eliot was being condescending. Horned Purple. You can see it actually on Broadway in Boulder any day in front of the pinball machine store. Horned Purple. This is the time of year when boys 15 and 17 wear 2 horned lilac blossoms in their caps or over one ear. What is it that does this? It is a certain sort, drivers for grocers or taxi drivers, white and colored, fellows that let their hair grow long in a curve over one eye, horned purple, dirty satyrs. It is vulgarity raised to the last power. They have stolen them, broken the bushes apart, with a curse for the owner. Lilacs. They stand in the doorways on the business streets with a sneer on their faces, adorned with blossoms. Out of their sweet heads, dark kisses, rough faces. It's very generous to notice that. It's nice for an old doctor to notice that little bit of eros and ancient satirical archetype in Rutherford, New Jersey. But there's only in isolate flecks that something is given off, so that the perception becomes more and more refined to recollect the isolate flecks as working in the hospital, perhaps glancing out of a window, he saw between walls the back wings of the hospital where nothing will grow lie cinders in which shine the broken pieces of a green bottle. I'll read that again because I spaced that while I was reading it. Between walls, the back wings of the hospital where nothing will grow lie cinders in which shine the broken pieces of a green bottle. And that's always been compared to sort of like a celebrated Chinese poem observing the beauty of an individual flower a solitary tree or individual flower in a spot. It's almost like adaptation of a traditional haiku or Chinese style to see the flowering of a bit of perception in the back wings of the hospital where nothing will grow. Lie cinders.
Was Williams aware of all these connections to haiku and Buddhism?
Oh yes, because there was an enormous practice of haiku from the days of Adelaide Crapsey in Seattle. In 1905, and Amy Lowell and Ezra Pound and all the imagists, des imagistes, the imagists themselves, did model, were influenced by Oriental writing, the Chinese hieroglyph, calligraphy, picture language, which Pound wrote a long essay on called The Chinese
Written by Buddhist thought also?
Well, to the extent that haiku and haiku is actually an extension of Buddhist practice, and they were translating haikus. They probably didn't notice it was Buddhist. But their aims were similar in terms of direct perception. So that the literary influences were pretty direct from some Buddhist sources, but other Confucian sources. Pound was interested in, he wrote an essay called The Chinese Written Character as a Medium for Poetry. Interested particularly in the fact that Chinese is picture language, and so doesn't have abstract words like truth or green. They would have a picture of, for green, I don't know what, a grass spear, rather green, a leaf maybe, whatever green elements there might be combined. I don't know what the hieroglyph would be. But anyway, they were influenced by Chinese and Japanese calligraphic writing, Chinese particularly, as picture image language. So that's sort of like an extreme of perception, or that is an extreme, almost literary extreme of perception. Though it's a real substantial glint, the green bottle gleam. His noticing of it in these literary terms is his own sort of artfulness, shrewdness. But there's a really astonishing piece of Americana, suburban imagery that has nothing to do with Chinese, except that it also gets some notion of shunyata, emptiness, into it. The term, a rumpled sheet of brown paper about the length and apparent bulk of a man was rolling with the wind slowly over and over in the street as a car drove down upon it and crushed it to the ground. Unlike a man, it rose again, rolling with the wind over and over to be as it was before. That's something I've seen on the streets, or the wind blowing a round piece of paper down the street. The apparent bulk, about the length and apparent bulk of a man. It's sort of like an amazing slow motion movie, because it does cast a clear picture image on the mind, like a slow motion movie of the brown paper rolling over in the Rutherford Street, a car passing over it, and then the wind. So actually what he's done is, by mentioning the wind once at the very end, he's created the whole torrent of wind down the street that day, or he's found a term to express the bulkiness of the wind. And the poem is called The Term. The term, like term for perception, or the term for the wind, but some mental measure or term. What does term mean, actually? The word term.
I felt
the terms in which we talk of reality.
I felt there it was length of time.
The length of time that it took for the wind to come down, the car to crush it down and bring it up.
Yeah, the term of life.
The term of life itself, maybe. I thought it was the aesthetic terms. The aesthetic term he was talking about. This is the term of his aesthetics. a completely natural Rutherford scene with no poetry in it, but the bare description of fact, bare attention, and description of detail that provides a machine made of words, or a word picture sufficiently clear to be projected in other people's minds once they got their home movie plugged into the wall by understanding his terms.
Like a mudra.
What sense is the word mudra here?
A perfect expression of the quality of what he describes.
Yeah, actually, it's a perfect expression of the quality of the wind.
Yeah.
It's the term of the wind, in a way. That's how I interpret it. The term of the wind, plus the term of his art. It's an ambiguous title. It's a nice poem because it's just got that funny little one slow motion image. Once you've seen it, you see it forever. So he was interested in details. Of course, it's actually it's a passion for observation, really, also. He has a little poem called Suzanne, which is not in his collected works, published in The Nation May 13th, 1961, which I always dug, because it was about some work of mine, called Suzanne. No pretense, no more than the French painters of the early years of the 19th century, to scant the truth of the light itself as it was reflected from a ballerina's thigh. This Ginsberg of Kaddish falls apart violently to a peal of laughter or to wrenched imprecation from a man's head. Nothing can stop the truth of it. Art is all we can say to reverse the chain of events and make a pile-up of passion to match the stars. No choice but between a certain variation hard to perceive in a shade of blue.
When was that published?
That was published in The Nation, May 13th, 1961. Cézanne. I think I talked a little bit about Cézanne's method of creating the little sensation of space by means of very fine adjustments of optic paint on flat canvas, hot colors receding, hot colors advancing, cold colors receding optically in the eyeball. As a matter of fact, if you look and put them side by side, you create a sensation of space, like turning the shutters of a Venetian blind. All of a sudden, sometimes a Cézanne painting will leap into 3D that way. Cézanne, no pretense, no more than the French painters of the early years of the 19th century, to scant the truth of the light itself as it was reflected from a ballerina's thigh. This Ginsberg of Kaddish falls apart violently to a peal of laughter or to wrenched imprecation from a man's head. Nothing can stop the truth of it. Art is all we can say to reverse the chain of events and make a pile-up of passion to match the stars. No choice but between a certain variation hard to perceive in a shade of blue. I was saying several things there, but the main thing is like careful attention to the final details of perception, to the finer details of perception. Certain, speaking of Cézanne here, no choice, no big romantic artistic choice of subject, but between a certain variation, hard to perceive, if staring closely and trying to match your blue paint with the blue of the shadow of the tree on the mountain. Yes. I can read on a little more Williams. I hate some students who were here before have heard me read some of these, and then last year I went through some of the same poems, and I hesitate to repeat, but the bulk of the people in the class aren't familiar with these specific poems, and I think they're highlights of Williams's practice. And they're good, solid poems you can get your mind's eye into. So it's a good entry into seeing Williams's larger work, or seeing the whole body of his work. If you get in with these poems, I think.
Are these from his later?
Pardon me?
The 60s or so?
Pardon me?
What dates are these going from? Are these from the 60s as well?
God, I haven't worked. No, these are not the 60s. These are the 20s. These are the 20s. He's working that early in that refined perception, that new consciousness, so to speak, which is overtaking everybody in the nation at this point.
How old was he then?
When was he born? 1896 or so? 90? 86 more likely. I've forgotten.
1889?
Maybe. We can look it up in the book later. So I guess he'd be 30, 35, 40. Midlife.
Did he work as
Mature, right? Mature, married, mature, children out. Just beginning to look around. Really seeing the world around him. Like a new husband, sort of.
Did he work as a doctor full time?
Yes, and when he worked as a pediatrician full time, and when I first went to see him, I asked him, "Do you think of yourself as a poet or a doctor?" And he said, "A doctor." He was full-time doctor. So it's a question of the whole problem of the structure of the universe. Then depends on our own perception of it, naturally. And here we've got a man working on his perceptions directly, using them as using the language as a way to recognize and refine his perceptions and to define his perceptions, perhaps, or to articulate them, but requiring mindfulness of original perception or first thought as the material for his work. A very manly work in a sense, though it's just purely aesthetic. So he's got a poem, "The Men," big macho aesthetic. The Men. Wherein is Moscow's dignity more than Passaic's dignity? A few men have added color better to the canvas. That's all. The river is the same. The bridges are the same. There is the same to be discovered of the sun. Look how cold, steel gray run the waters of the Passaic. The church of the Polacks' bulbous towers kissed the sky just so sternly, so dreamily, as in Warsaw, as in Moscow. Violet smoke rises from the mill chimneys. Only the men are different who see it, draw it down in their minds, or might be different. Only the men might be different. That's a very clear social poem. I mean, it really provides a program for American painters and aesthetes and politicians, finally. Movie makers, style brokers. But it's a kind of slow, patient process. So he's got, in his collected later poems, which I'm now beginning to deal with, a sort of song. Let the snake wait under his weed, and the writing be of words, slow and quick, sharp to strike, quiet to wait, sleepless. Through metaphor, to reconcile the people and the stones. Compose. No ideas but in things. Invent. Saxifrage is my flower that splits the rocks. Saxifrage is a weed that grows in rock and in pavements, and by dint of its durance, hardiness, and native
No ideas but in things. Invent.
Mm-hmm.
Invent.
Mm-hmm.
Invent.
Combinations of things.
What about the things as they appear?
Well, you got to invent them too. You have to invent things as they appear. Also,
To the works.
there's no way out. I see. A sort of song is the name of the poem. But what is the native thing that saxifrage is to the soil that makes it more habituated to the soil than the concrete? Well, the concrete crumbles and the saxifrage apparently can renew itself inexhaustibly and split the rocks of imperception. So he's saying, though there's no escape except the observation of that certain variation in the color of blue, in the shade of blue, though it may seem like a very minor activity being stuck with the details of earth, in a very small and non-romantic activity, a very small and non-romantic enterprise for poetics, still it's sure as saxifrage to split the rocks of civilization if the perception can be maintained, if mindfulness can be maintained, if the mind doesn't get lost, if the mind doesn't get lost in the world of its own invention, or purely of its own invention. The cure, so he got depressed because it was a lot of hard work naturally, and boring, as they say of meditation. Sometimes I envy others, fear them a little too, if they write well. For when I cannot write, I'm a sick man and want to die. The cause is plain. But they have no access to my sources. Let them write as they may and perfect it as they can, they will never come to the secret of that form, interknit with the unfathomable ground where we walk daily, and from which, among the rest, you have sprung and opened, flower-like to my hand. So he really knows where he is, and he's got all the all his powers assembled, and now is beginning to display them. Here's a piece of vipassana, or mindfulness, insight into detail, called perfection. O lovely apple, beautifully and completely rotten, hardly a contour marred, perhaps a little shriveled at the top, but that aside perfect in every detail. O lovely apple, what a deep and suffusing brown mantles that unspoiled surface. No one has moved you since I placed you on the porch rail a month ago to ripen. No one. No one. So he's been meditating on that apple a month. Put that little apple out there on the porch rail, and he's been watching it all month, and finally the moment of perfection's come when the apple is ripened in his mind. He realizes that he alone, like Plotinus, alone with the alone, or alone in the alone, has got a perfection of perception at this point, perfection of being. There's a lot of short poems that might be looked at. What does he do when he gets into a violent scene where all perceptions are jarred? The last turn. Then see it in distressing detail from behind a red light at 53rd and 8th of a November evening, the jazz of the cross lights echoing the crazy weaves of the breaking mind. Splash of half-purple, half-naked woman's body whose jeweled guts the cars drag up and down. No house but has its brains blown off by the dark. Nothing recognizable, the whole one jittering direction made of all directions, spelling the inexplicable, pigment upon flesh and flesh to pigment, the genius of the world, against which rages the fury of our concepts, artless but supreme. That's kind of sitting on your fence, James Sherry, in the sense that he's finally seeing that what we see is also a pure concept, particularly in moments of car crash.
How does the last few lines go? He leads up to concept, and then somehow he...
Nothing recognizable, the one whole jittering direction, made of all directions, spelling the inexplicable. It does get a little bit corny there, I'd say. Spelling the inexplicable. Sounds like my father there a little bit. That's spelling the inexplicable. But it's not a visual image. So he's violated no ideas but in things. Chalk did it. Pigment upon, but he did get that November evening jazz, cross lights echoing, crazy weave of the breaking mind, splash of half purple, half naked woman's body whose jeweled guts the cars drag up and down. He did get a flash photo before he went off. Pigment upon flesh and flesh to pigment. That's a little bit back to the original image. The genius of the pigment, the genius of the world. I guess flesh to pigment, the genius of the world. Against which, actually I don't understand the end of the poem, against which rages the fury of our concepts. I suppose a shock, despair, disbelief, terror, the fury of our concepts. Artless but supreme. I guess actually the flesh, the genius of the world, is artless but supreme, rather than our concepts here. So maybe he isn't on the fence after all. I thought for a minute he was taking your position. The thoughtful lover. Deny yourself all half things. Have it or leave it, but it'll keep, or it is not worth having. Never start anything you can't finish. However, do not lose faith because you are starved. She loves you, she says. Believe it, tomorrow. But today, the particulars of poetry, that difficult art, require your whole attention. The thoughtful lover. Here he is a little tiny, very minor poem called Silence, where he returns to the haiku form, or approaches again that haiku silence. Under a low sky, this quiet morning of red and yellow leaves, a bird disturbs no more than one twig of the green-leaved peach tree. A bird disturbs no more than one twig of the green-leaved peach tree. So you notice that. That's a pretty close thing to notice. Very delicate thing to notice. Have to keep thinking about writing a poem to do that. That's sort of an artful one.
Say some more about that. Would you? Thinking about writing a poem.
What poem was that?
Constantly.
Silence. I forgot about that poem a minute after I read it. What will I say?
Just that sense of, you got a sense that you meant that he was kind of constantly aware that he was.
Oh, writing a poem. Oh, yes. That was sort of a little afterthought that I was ashamed of. I immediately amnesiized it. Well, under a low sky, this quiet morning of red and yellow leaves. So you'd have to look out there and say, oh, gee, that's red, that's yellow. You call that red or leaf. How do you describe it? Well, quiet morning of red and yellow leaves. Well, at least you got the red and yellow leaves, keeping the morning quiet. Then, there must be a poem here. Or maybe not even thinking about it, but just looking at it. And then a bird disturbed one twig. So he noticed the lightness of the bird, I guess, coming in or zooming out. And then at some point or other, he must have noticed that it was, the title of the poem is Silence. So there's a funny correlation between just the one twig moving in total silence, and how almost imperceptible the complete universe of the bird was, except that he was happening to look at it. So at some point or other, he must have remembered or recollected just having seen that, and then maybe looked out the window again to get some more detail, red and yellow leaves, or quiet morning of red and yellow leaves. This sounds like something he may have revised also, to order the sequence of perceptions in their chronological order, or at least with the background of red and yellow leaves. But no more than one twig is a very odd phrase. Disturbs no more than one twig. So I was thinking, gee, it could have made a big mess, come splashing down like the great rock and splintered the entire tree, or I've come thrashing in. But apparently the bird was quite conscious of how it alighted. So it was a little consciousness of the bird he was noticing, and the delicacy of the bird, which may have made him think of his own art, and the exactness and delicacy and precision of his mind lighting on objects, and then adjusting words, or hearing words in his head perhaps. So no more than one twig. The word one there is sort of like, you'd have to think up a word to deal with the piece of wood that moved, the piece of living wood that moved. You have to think of, notice it was only one, and that's sort of a language thing. It's an odd language intrusion on the picture, to label the twig one, and to label the action, to locate the subtlety of the action in just the word one and one twig. No more than one twig is kind of strange. It's very almost abstract for him to arrive at that as the description of what happened. To have thought that was the characteristic noticing point or highlight of what happened with the bird. It's no more than one twig moved.
What I'm intrigued by in what you said was that sense of a craftsman looking for things to write about, so that his perception is very conditioned by the
his
goals
practice.
By what he's.
It's a circular system. Having gambled for that world, he's then reduced to looking for instances to prove his theory. It's as if he's produced this as an instance, and that's why it's in this Chinese haiku form, very literary form. Or perhaps he was reading haikus, and that reminded him he could do a little notation like that. But it's a very bare notation. It's very clear, bare notation. It's a good example of Williams practicing. It's like practice, in the sense that sitting meditation, as called practice, does consist not in the accomplishing of a consciousness, but in the practicing of switching consciousness around from one place to another.
Switching meditation around.
Yeah. Could this be called a meditation, a form of meditation, I wonder? Or a byproduct of vipassana, that a bird disturbs no more than one twig of the green leaf tree? Well, it's meditation mixed with ambition for writing a poem.
What we're doing, though, is ambition to meditate, writing the poetry.
Now, say it clearly now. What we're doing is what? Ambition to meditate.
Right. The way you're reading the poems, or what you're using to illustrate is the poetry of the ambition to meditate.
You could say that, but it's also poetry. A little more clearly, it would be poetry displaying characteristics of meditation.
That's. I've heard a lot about
including ambition to meditate.
What?
Including ambition to meditate, which is only one of the characteristics. The other characteristics is that if you do it, you see something. Or you see the silence too. Yeah.
I've heard a lot about a poem about a cat walking on the fence. Do you think you could find that?
A poem about a cat walking on a fence. It's I could find it somewhere. It would take a while, and I spend so much time looking over it that everybody would get bored and think I was a drag. It's about. I think it ends with the cat putting his feet into a flower pot, stepping carefully off, just like this same mindfulness as this sparrow lighting, disturbing only one branch. The cat very mindfully stepping perhaps off the fence or over the windowsill, putting one foot into a flower pot and then another.
Alan, I think the first line is the cat stepped over, so if you want to look at the list, the first line
Unfortunately, there's no list of first lines in this book. There's only a list of titles. It's a defective book. I mean, it's a defective hardcover edition of Williams.
I think that's one poem where Williams kind of makes you hear the silence.
Yeah.
Because you can, as the cat is putting its feet in
Yes.
the flower pot, it's not making any sound at all.
Yeah.
You can hear it not making any sound.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that is one that has that same silence as the one called Silence. See if there's anything else of importance. Oh, there's a funny one that's just like Reznikov a little later on here. The Horse. Oh, yeah, there's a couple. The Manoeuvre, more about the little birds. He did then apparently continuously over a period of years observe the birds, sparrows around him, or starlings. The Manoeuvre. I saw the two starlings coming in toward the wires, but at the last, just before alighting, they turned in the air together and landed backwards. That's what got me, to face into the wind's teeth. So this is like perhaps less literary. That's what got me. It's called the Manoeuvre. Turned in the air together and landed backwards. That's what got me. That's really American tongue there. To face into the wind's teeth. The Horse. The horse moves independently without reference to his load. He has eyes like a woman and turns them about, throws back his ears, and is generally conscious of the world. Yet he pulls when he must, and pulls well, blowing fog from he like fumes from the twin exhausts of a car. That's a simile, like. Well, he indulged himself in a little simile, but it's a simile between local horse and an even more modern contemporary artifact, a car. So he doesn't feel it's too far-fetched, maybe in terms of ordinariness. Very beautiful piece which includes perfect description as of a flower and perfect reproduction of conversation. Because part of the object that Williams is perceiving is his own speech or the speech of others. So language, speech, is in itself a starling, a bird, or a set of birds whose behavior can be observed. The way people talk can be watched as closely as roses or starlings and reproduced on the page with equal accuracy. This is called The Act, which is a poem I think Robert Creeley profited from, observed at great length, profited from, imitated in his first book. Creeley's early poems are very directly derived from these little short later poems of Williams. Creeley's titles are very similar, in fact. The Act. There were the roses in the rain. Don't cut them, I pleaded. They won't last, she said. But they're so beautiful where they are. Ah, we were all beautiful once, she said, and cut them and gave them to me in my hand. So here's a combination of, there's a little description. There were the roses in the rain. Actually, it's quite, he's getting such a master of description. He says there were the roses in the rain. Sort of like a little very fast Cézanne notation, a little Cézanne's, or a late Picasso, or Matisse, more Matisse almost, a little Matisse line. Very abstracted by that point. There were the roses in the rain. But his attention is really on the quality, what's said, of course, the content of the speech, but the way it's said, because I think this is probably the first time one of the first times, perhaps, if not the first time in the history of American diction, poetic diction, that they use the word spelled A-G-H. I mean, that took a certain amount of courage in those days to say So actually hear him hear his wife saying ah, and include that instead of, sort of amnesiizing the ah and having her say ah or oh, that we were all beautiful ones. Ah, we were all beautiful ones. That ah, that carries exactly it's the mot juste. It carries just the precise feeling in America for that mudra, that vocal gesture. So he was a great teacher for that, I think, like a great teacher of definite perception of speech. So the lesson out of that is you pay attention. As you pay attention to your own speech. And when you're writing, just do it in the order that your mind suggests. But making use of accidents of speech or of idiosyncratic noises, idiosyncratic syntax, idiosyncratic meaning broken or non-symmetrical or not by the rules or invented or chance or accidental or customary, like.
Was Williams familiar with Chinese at all?
Tom Savage, was Williams familiar with Chinese at all? I don't think he read Chinese, though he read, as I said, lots of Chinese poetry and translation through Pound and through the vogue of chinoiserie of those years in letters, but he didn't know Chinese directly, no. I think at one time, around this time actually, come to think of it, he worked with a young Chinese translating poet from San Francisco who used to hang around City Lights. And he was corresponding with him. The kid, I forgot his name, David Wang, perhaps, was a friend and correspondent of Ezra Pound, and was corresponding also with Williams. I think Pound had sent David Wang to Williams, and they had a little project of doing some Chinese translations according to Poundian Williams-esque principles. But that was the closest he got. So probably David Wang sent him some written characters with the translations, some pages with the Chinese characters and the translations, so he could see the pictures and with the pictures explained.